Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Lesh. I'm a software engineer at Google. I'm also the project lead for RxJS, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And as of about 6 weeks ago, I'm on the Angular core team now. So it's kind of exciting news, at least for me. So before I dive into adding features to an app with RxJS, how many people here have actually used RxJS before? We've got a few people, quite a few people. That's good. So really quickly, I want to go over what RxJS is. I'm not going to go into super deep detail. For those of you that aren't familiar with RxJS, my hope is from this talk, you'll be able to see me do some pretty advanced stuff and get excited about it and explore it some more. You might be a little lost while I'm going through this or be like, what's happening? That's fine. This is just more intended to show you some of the more powerful features, the things that you can do with RxJS. And for those of you who've used it a bit before, maybe you can learn some new patterns. So observables are the core thing that RxJS is about. It's this type. It's the main focus. Everything you do in RxJS is about creating observables. Observables are a type that are very similar to promises. They push values at you. The difference is promises give you one value. An observable can give you 0 to many values over any amount of time. They're also lazy. Promises are not lazy. When you have a promise, whatever was kicking off the async thing that's going to give you a value later for that promise has already started. Observables are like functions. You have to subscribe to them to get them to do anything. Just because there's an observable there doesn't mean it's doing anything. And they're cancelable, which means anything an observable is doing, you can unsubscribe from it later on and tell the observable to stop. So again, observables require subscription. So this is like a promise then. It's the same sort of thing with observable subscribe, but the difference is the act of calling subscribe is actually going to kick off what the observable does. It's going to tell some code to do something to start producing data and start sending it out through this callback we're providing here, which we're taking a value and just logging it out. So every time the observable emits a new value, we're logging it to console with this first callback. The second callback is the error handler. And the error handler is responsible for if the observable experiences an error and it needs to stop, you will be notified on this second channel. And the final channel is completion. This is saying, hey, there's no more values. I've successfully produced all the values I can from my observable. I'm just notifying you that this is done. So this is kind of the punctuation on the end of the observable. They also give the ability to cancel. So when you call subscribe, it returns the subscription object. And the subscription object is something you want to hang on to, because later on, you want to call unsubscribe on it when you no longer want values from your observable. You don't have to do this with all observables, just any observable that you think you need to cancel. Say it's an endless observable of an interval or a WebSocket or something. The most important thing to note about observables is observables push values. They can push values synchronously or asynchronously, but they push values at you. You can get 0 values, you can get an infinite number of values. It can happen over any amount of time. They also push a notification when you're done successfully, and they push a notification if it's experienced an error. Another important thing to think about observables is observables are collections. They're actually, even though they're pushing values at you over time, if you think about it, these are collections of events, or they're collections of pushed values that happen over a certain amount of time. And the interesting thing about collections is collections have this really cool property of having different operations you can perform on them. For example, you can filter them or query them, right? So you can get a collection and make a smaller collection out of it. You can transform one collection of things into another collection of things by mapping it. You can accumulate values from a collection into a smaller collection or into a single value. You can join 2 collections together into a single collection. You can flatten a collection of collections into a single collection. So there's a lot of very interesting things you can do with collections of things, not just observables. One case that a lot of you are probably familiar with is arrays, right? We use arrays all the time. Arrays are collections. So arrays are collections where we have these operations like filter, which we'd be querying an array and getting a smaller array, or map, where we're taking an array and mapping it into a new array of different shaped things, or reduce, where you're taking an array, and in this case, reduce it on array is a little bit different. We can reduce it down to a single value and not just a smaller array. So with observables, you have these same exact sort of features. So here we've got filter, map, and reduce again. And each one of these operations is producing a new observable. Now the kind of mind-bending thing about this is As I stated before, observables don't do anything until you subscribe to them. So when I'm saying, here's an observable, filter it, and it gives me another observable, what I'm doing is I'm kind of building a function in a way. I'm building a new observable that when I subscribe to it, subscribes to the original source and then filters it out into a new source. So it's a little bit different than arrays in that manner, in that it doesn't just happen synchronously, but all of those same sorts of operations are there. And because observables have the element of time, because they push values at you over time, there's a lot of other more interesting operations we can perform. Like we can debounce things or throttle things for like client-side rate limiting. You can delay a value, so when a value arrives and you can tell it to wait before it actually sends it along. You can combine the latest values from multiple observables. You can switch to a new observable each time when you're doing a flattening sort of thing. So it's these time-based sort of things are different than what you might find with other collections. So just to give you some basic examples of things you can do with observables, this is a basic, you could have a drag and drop. Now when you see a variable during my talk that ends with a $, that variable contains an observable. This is actually called finish notation. It's not a requirement. You can name your variables however you choose. This is just something I'm doing for the talk, and it's a standard that some people adhere to. I'm doing it for the talk, so it's easier to recognize what variables in my code are observables. So here, what we have is an observable of mouse down events. So it's just a stream of every single time there's a mouse down, it's going to fire an event. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to map that into mouse move events. So every time there's a mouse down, I'm going to map it into mouse movements, and I'm going to take those mouse movements until there's a mouse up event. So what we end up with there is when someone presses down on the mouse, I get a bunch of movement values until they let go of the mouse. And so this is basic drag and drop. We're going to look a little bit more at this later. Or a save button that you can't double submit. So sometimes you have a situation where you don't want someby sending their credit card information more than once, and you have a save button, you don't want them to click it multiple times and submit over and over again. This is an operation called exhaust map, and what exhaust map does is it says, hey, take this button click, map it into my HTTP post observable, and subscribe to it, and exhaust that. Wait until it's done before you allow another one to be mapped and subscribed to. That's exhaust map. So again, there's a lot of vernacular around what happens in RxJS. I don't expect everyone to walk away remembering all of these operators. This is just to show kind of the powerful things you can do. Throttled auto-suggest. This is kind of the idiomatic RxJS example that a lot of people give. This is where you have a thing where you've got an input, and when you type in the input, you put suggestions below it in some sort of drop-down. When you have something like that, you usually want to debounce when people are pressing the keys, because you don't want to send a request every single time someone presses a key in there. Your server folks would hate you for that. Don't do that. So you can actually add, there's an operation debounce time, and just by adding this in there declaratively, you can, in this case, debounce it by half a second every single time. It'll wait for half a second after the last input change to actually map it into our HTTP GET and subscribe to that. So composing asynchrony, or composing events, not just asynchrony, is really where RxJS shines. Is composing multiple different, and every one of those previous examples I just showed you is multiple different types of events that we're trying to coordinate together. RxJS can be used everywhere. So I'm going to be talking about Angular today, but before I ever worked for Google, I worked at Netflix, and at Netflix I worked on RxJS projects in Node with React and with Ember. I've worked with people that have used it in Vue, embedded JS, all sorts of different JavaScript engines. This is a general use tool for anywhere in JavaScript. You can use it in any of your projects. So again, Angular is where I'm going to be focusing this talk because I've got this Angular app that I'm going to add some new features to. So that's remainder. How many people here have used Angular? Quite a few. Very good. Very good. My team will be happy to know that. So remember before I was talking about how observables require subscription. They don't do anything until you subscribe to them. And then there's this whole thing of wanting to hang on to the subscription and unsubscribe from it later. For those of you unfamiliar with Angular, Angular is the only framework right now that has kind of a unique feature with observables in this pipe async. And what this is we're actually binding out an observable in our template, and the pipe async says, hey, whenever this div shows, or whenever this part of my template is showing, I want you to subscribe to this observable, and every time a value comes out of it, I want to update this binding. And then whenever it's hidden, I want you to unsubscribe from that for me. So it kind of manages this subscription for you, which is a very nice feature. To the point where even if I had an ngIf here, this ngIf says if show happens to be a value of true, then show everything in here. And when that's true, it's going to subscribe to the observable. And when you flip show to false, it's going to unmount that component from your view, and it will unsubscribe from your observable automatically, which is very nice. If you want more information on the basics of RxJS and kind of the meat of what's going on inside of this, I did a talk before. You can look at this. It's from a few years ago. You'll get to see a fatter version of me doing the talk, which is good. But I'll send these slides out later. It's got the link, and this is actually even embedded in there. You can click it and watch fat me tell you about RxJS. So this is the app we're going to update today. It's a newsfeed app. It's really all it does is it makes an HTTP request to get an array of data, and then we bind it out to the view, and we get this list here. We're going to add two features. The first feature we're going to add is just an auto refresh, where every so often it goes and gets the latest news for you. This is all just randomly generated stuff, by the way. This is not actual news. Mobile driver hacking bus is not a thing. The other feature that we're going to add, and I chose this one very specifically, is the drag down to load. So we are all familiar with, you'll have your phone and you'll be looking at Twitter and you want to refresh the feed and you pull down and you get the little icon that comes down and it spins. That's the feature we're going to add here, and I chose it for a variety of reasons. It's very, very complicated bit of event coordination that you have to do this. So let's talk about the existing app. The basic structure of our existing app is really just two parts. We've got a newsfeed service, which is responsible for getting the newsfeed data, and we've got this latest news component, which is responsible for just kind of rendering that data to a template, to a view. So the latest news component looks like this. It's got some imports at the top there. We don't really need to focus on those. I'll kind of just more focus on this. So I've got my component declaration. This is an Angular thing. And it says what selector we're using and where the template lives and where the styles live. And then down here, we've got the class that actually defines the important stuff, really, for the component. And what we have is we've got this news property that is a news observable. Now, one interesting thing I want you to know is frequently when we're dealing with promises, you have this thing where you've got a function that returns a promise, right? And you have all these methods on your class that are these methods that return promises. The reason you do that is actually because promises are not lazy, and you really wanted laziness. You didn't know that you wanted laziness, but you don't want your promises just to start at the beginning of your app, so you wrap them in a function. Observables are already lazy, so you don't have to wrap them in a function if they're not parameterized, right? So this news observable here is just waiting there for us to subscribe to it. And then our template for our latest news component looks like this. What we've got here is I've got ng4 at the top, and what that's doing is you see I've got news $pipe async there. I'm binding out my observable, and so every time it emits a value, that ng4 is going to loop over that value, because the value is an array. So it's going to loop over that array and then bind out all of the information inside of here. So it's just a for loop for every single time that observable emits to render the data out. And here's our newsfeed service. Newsfeed service is pretty straightforward. So what we have in here is it also has a news property, and the news property is using our HTTP client that comes from Angular to say, here's an observable of go and get this data via HTTP. So again, it won't go get it until you subscribe to it. And then I've got some error handling in here, and another important thing I've got down here is I've got share. And what share says is this is multicast, which means that when you subscribe to this, if a bunch of other bits of code subscribe to it at the same time, it doesn't make a bunch of AJAX requests. It keeps the one and then shares that one response with all of the other subscribers. So it's an important little bit there. So again, all of that code that we had there is what gave us our basic feed, and that's all we have for right now. Just this. So let's add our update interval feature. We're going to start with this one because it's the easiest one. What we're going to need to do this is I think I want to refactor the newsfeed service first, because right now it's just got this news thing in here, and when you subscribe to it, you just get one result back, and that's it. And wouldn't it be cool if that news observable gave us more than one result back? Like if we had something to trigger to, hey, I want to tell you to get another one, and then it just pumped out another one wherever I had it bound out. So what I'm going to do in order to do this is I'm going to add this refresh property. Well, first I'm going to kind of rename what was formerly in my news property here. I'm going to rename it to load news. That's all I did. It's exactly the same code. It's just I renamed it. And I added a new news property down here, and it's derived from this refresh here. And what refresh is it's a behavior subject. Behavior subjects are observables that have a next method on them. It's got a couple other methods too. It happens to be an observer as well. But for those of you not familiar with Rx, it's just got this next method on it, and when I next a value into it, it's emitted from the observable. So it's kind of an imperative way to create an observable. The other interesting thing about behavior subjects is they cache the most recent value. In this case, we're starting with null because it doesn't really matter what the value is because we're not using it. And as soon as you subscribe, it will give you the most recent value that it has stored. So I'm using that to feed into news here. So every single time something nexts into my refresh, it's going to say, hey, I want to go get more news. Right? And then that's going to be emitted from my news property here on my newsfeed service. So because it's named the same and it's outputting the same type of data, I don't have to really update my component yet in order to use this. So we do need to update our latest news component a little bit, though. See, we already have the news property there. It's the same as it was before. What I want to do is I want to add something that's a timer to this. So in this case, I want to say, all right, I want some data right now, and then once every 30 seconds. So that's what this 30,000 is here. So I'm going to use the timer function, which comes from RxJS, and it returns an observable of, it's just like an observable interval. So timer with 2 arguments. It says at 0 milliseconds, I want you to emit a value. And that value happens to be 0, and then it emits 1, and then 2, and so on. We're not really using the numbers it emits, but we're saying at 0 milliseconds, I want you to emit a value, and then every 30 seconds afterwards, every 30,000 milliseconds afterwards, I want you to emit another value. And that we want to then pump into that refresh property that we put on our service. So in order to do that, I'm going to actually add this onInit. So this onInit function, it's pretty much the same thing as component will mount or something like that in React. And what we're going to do is inside of there, I'm going to subscribe to my refresh timer, and I'm going to pump its values into refresh, that behavior subject. And what this does is it says every single time that timer emits, call next on that refresh, which then triggers the news to be reloaded. The other thing I have to do is, you notice I'm capturing the subscription here already. I have to declare my subscription up here so we have a place to put it. And then I'm going to add this ng onDestroy, and I'm going to move this up a little bit so you can see it. I'm going to add this onDestroy, which is on your, like an on component will unmount, if you're familiar with React or some of the other frameworks. Where I actually unsubscribe from this. And that just means that when the component is mounted or unmounted, it will manage that subscription for you and clean things up. So this is the entirety of everything we actually added to the component so far, so you get a better look at it. And just to recap what we've done so far is we used a behavior subject to reactively trigger the reload. And then we used a timer to next into that same behavior subject in our newsfeed service. And then we had to manage subscription a little bit in our onInit and onDestroy. And what we have now, and I changed this to 3 seconds so it's a little bit more visible, is this now just refreshes automatically. So we didn't have to add a whole lot of code to get this done. That's the basic feature. So things I want you to notice is I didn't have to touch the template at all to get this done. There was no changes there. The refactor was pretty small, and it's hard to see because we didn't have to change a whole lot, but we actually kind of work backwards when you're working reactively. It helps to implement the smallest thing first and kind of go backwards. All right, so that there was probably on a hardness scale, RxJS-wise, was probably like a 3 or a 4 out of 10. Pull down to reload feature, this is like 10 or 11 on that scale. So this is going to be a bit more to follow, but it's a pretty cool feature. So pull down to reload, again, to just to describe the features and what it needs to do, is it doesn't start until the user touches their phone, right? But there's a trick to this too, because someone can touch, and then without ending the touch, start another touch, right? That's totally a valid thing with a mobile device. It's then got to track the downward pull with some sort of icon that's got to follow kind of roughly where your finger has gone. And if the pull gets past a certain point, then you want to trigger a load and spin that icon for a while until the load is finished, and then it has to animate that icon back up to where it belongs, up to the top. But if the pull doesn't cross that point and they let go, then it's got to animate that icon back out of there. You don't want the icon just hanging around. So there's a lot of stuff we have to coordinate to get this done. So just a list of the various events we need to coordinate. We have start, move, and end touch events that we have to coordinate. We've got Ajax. We want to know when the Ajax starts and when it completes, so we know when to start spinning and when to animate things out. Of course, we have animations. Those all have. We need to know when animations complete. We need to know when to update the screen or update the view to move things. So it's a lot of stuff to coordinate. So what I'm going to do to do this is I'm going to build a touch drag to load component, and this is just going to control that load icon, that little marker that we're moving down. It's going to animate it. It's going to manage all the touch events and that sort of thing. And the other thing it's going to do is provide an event that we're going to hook that says, hey, go ahead and refresh the events. So I'm going to have to refactor the latest news component. The latest news component is going to have to include the touch drag to load component in its template. And we're going to have to wire up the event that comes out of that touch drag to load to that newsfeed service refresh, so it knows to get the next bit of news. So let's just get started with the touch drag to load component. Aside from all the Angular stuff, the component declaration and stuff that you normally have at the top, what we have is just a class, and this output annotation here. This is just an Angular thing that says, hey, this is something where I can actually register an event on this component in my template. And then event emitter is another Angular thing that says this basically refresh is a place where if I imperatively call emit on it, then wherever someone's wired up an event to their component in Angular, it's going to emit the value that I've passed into that event emitter. So this is just kind of setting up an event point in our component. Our HTML for our template looks like this. I don't have anything dynamic in here yet, but just to kind of go over it, I've got an outer div that kind of positions things to the center. I've got an inner div, and its whole job is to manage the vertical position and a little bit the horizontal position. You see I'm adjusting it negative 35 pixels. That's because I know that I have a circle that I'm going to use as my icon that's 70 pixels in diameter. So that's just to kind of center it. And what we're going to do is we're going to end up changing the Y position of Translate 3D there to kind of move things up and down. And then I've got my SVG. It's got a rotation of 0 right there. And the reason I stubbed this in is because we're going to use that rotation to actually rotate the circle, the SVG circle that we have. Then we have a couple of circles inside of our SVG. One is a large one that's light gray, and the other one is smaller and black and just kind of sitting on top of it so we can actually see that it's spinning. If you spin a circle with nothing inside of it, it just looks like a circle, right? That's not very exciting. So our latest news component, this is our template. It looks like this. We need to add one thing, which is we're going to add our touch drag to refresh component to the top of it. And you see here where I've wired up that refresh event. And what I'm going to do is I don't even really have to touch my TypeScript for this component. I'm going to just say, hey, the newsfeed service, which is already registered on the component, dot refresh, that's our behavior subject, just call next on it. So every single time this refresh event is called, I want you to just call next on this behavior subject, and every time next is called on the behavior subject, it goes and gets more news. So it's wired up right now, as long as we trigger our refresh at some point. So right now, if we just look, we can see it. There's our icon just hanging out up there at the top. It's not doing anything yet because we haven't done anything to make it do anything, but we can see that our component is now in our view at the very least. So let's start by kind of making this stuff dynamic. So before, our style transform was just actual HTML inlined. I'm going to use Angular to say I want to update our style transform with observables. So you see this transform position, the transform positions pipe async. So transform positions is an observable. You can see by the $sign there. And we're saying every single time that updates, write it out into this style. We're doing the same thing for rotations. There's a transform rotates right there. And we're going to go into our component and actually just set up the simplest possible thing. Now, of just says, give me, this comes from RxJS, it just says, give me an observable of this one value and complete it. It's the simplest possible observable, just here's a value. And you see it has the exact same strings that we had in the styles before. So it's the minimal thing just to get the view to work. So we can see that, oh, look, it did dynamically update that. I'm going to change this a little bit more and say, well, I would really like to be dealing with numbers and not strings all day. So, because I know I want to change the position of this thing. So I'm going to make another property called positions that just, I'm going to say of 0, and then I'm going to map that into the string that is my translate 3D string that I need to put into the style. And I'm going to do the same thing for my rotations here. So rotate, just a rotation of 0, and then we're going to map that into the actual style string that it expects. So it still looks the same. I haven't really done anything to it, but right now it is being dynamically set at the very least. But it still looks the same, which is it's good. So this is kind of working your way backwards. So we've done the simplest possible thing first. So I'm going to make a slight tweak to this to make sure the marker is off the screen. So for any single position value that comes through, I'm saying subtract 70 from it. And that's, again, the diameter of our circle. So that's going to move it off the screen so it would no longer be visible. And now let's move on to actually kind of getting a feature into this. Let's just make it so when we touch and drag, it will change the position of that icon. So you remember our basic drag and drop I talked about earlier, where I've got our mouse downs and we're mapping that into mouse movements until someone does a mouse up and subscribing to the movements. This same pattern works for touch as well. The difference is we're going to be doing touch start, touch move, and touch end instead of mouse down and mouse up, mouse move. And from event is a function that comes from RxJS, and it just basically says, I want to add an event listener to document with touch start, and every single event object that comes out of that, I want to emit that from an observable. So each one of these is an observable of touch events. And what we're doing down here is we're composing that in exactly the same manner that we did with mouse moves. We're saying every touch start that happens, I want you to start giving me touch move values until there's a touch end event that happens. And we can add this directly into our component. You'll see I've commented out some of the other things that were in the component so we could fit the code in the screen. But this is pretty much it. So we've got these properties of touch start, touch move, touch end, and I'm using them to create this touch drags observable. So this touch drags observable, though, is an observable of touch events still, because it's touch move events is what I'm getting out of that, but only when I'm between a touch start and a touch end. And I want to derive positions now, instead of being just of an observable of 0, I want to derive it from touch drags. But we still have a problem here in that what we wanted was we want, because when I get a touch event in Y here, and a touch event of Y is not a number. So if I subtract 70 from it, I'll get some NaN JavaScript garbage out of that. We don't want that. So we're going to have to add this mapping up here, and the mapping just says, hey, from this touch start event, or from the current touch move event, take the page Y position and subtract the page Y position from wherever you started. So it's just some basic math to get how far you've dragged down. during each touch move event. And that's going to give us, touch drags is then an observable of numbers. So now we get these numbers that are coming through, and we're subtracting 70 from them, and we're updating our positions, which will update our translate 3D, which will update our view. So that's basically what we want to add. There's one other little bit that we want to add here is this. There's an operator from RxJS called start with. In start with 0, what it says is the first value that comes out of this observable needs to be a 0. And that's just so it moves itself off the screen at the beginning of the subscription to this. So here you've got a demo of me just kind of dragging down, and it follows where my finger is, roughly speaking, from the top with an offset of 70 pixels. So it's good. We've got it dragging. It's not the entirety of our feature, but we're getting there. So let's move on to the next part of this. How about if we just have it animate home when we let go? Like, we won't get to the load part yet. We'll just go kind of piece by piece. Just have it go right back up to the top whenever our finger comes off. So there's a disclaimer in this. I'm not going to dive deeply into animations in RxJS. I did a whole talk on this. Again, I'm going to send out my slides afterwards. You don't have to write this down now. But it gets into animation frames and some of the theory and stuff behind it. What you need to know is that I have this Rx animation service with a tween method on it. What that does is it returns an observable that gives you a series of numbers over a specific duration. And those numbers start at a start value and they end at an end value. And all the numbers in between are at various points in between those two numbers based off of an animation frame. So every animation frame fires, and if you started at 0 and you went to 10, then an animation frame fires, maybe you'd get 1.2, and the next time you get 3.4, and so on, all the way up to 10, and then the observable completes. So this we're using to tween between two different values over a certain amount of time. So what we want to do, back to our code here, is we're going to add, and we don't need to focus on positions now, we're just going to focus on the touch drags part. I'm going to add this move home animations property. So move home is using my animations tween to have this animation observable that it just plays values between whatever the current position is, where I've got this private property underscore POS, that's the current position, to 0. So it's going to animate from there to 0 when you subscribe to this thing. And it's kind of hard to see here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the touch moves, this whole bulk of what's happening in here, and I'm actually going to concatenate it with move home. And what concatenation does with observables is it says, when you concatenate two observables, it says play one observable to completion, and once it stops, start playing the next observable to completion. So it's a way of kind of coordinating how two observables play together, and that works really well for animations. So what I'm saying here is, whenever you start touching, you want to map that into touch movements, and you take those until you let go, until the touch ends. And as soon as that's done, play this animation right afterwards, this move home, which is going to play a series of values that moves the icon back up to the top. We have one other little piece here. There's a catch. We need something to update our current position so we know where to animate from to go back to 0. So I'm adding this operator here called tap. And what tap does is it says, I want to examine whatever the current value is of this observable here and do some side effect with it. It doesn't affect it in any way. It's just a way to kind of tap in and look at what's happening in the observable. And so what we're doing is we're taking the position that's going to be emitted from touch drags, and we're using it to update our current position. And there's one other little tricky problem here is whenever we defined that animation observable up here on move home, POS is always 0 because it's defined right there whenever you initialize the object. So we need a way to delay that for later. So every time you subscribe to our move home, it gets the latest position and not just whatever it was whenever you initialize the object. And in order to do that, there is a function from RxJS called defer. And what defer is you give it a function that returns an observable, and what it says is, here's an observable that when you subscribe to it, calls this factory function to create a new observable and hands the subscription to that. So it just kind of defers or delays the creation of observable until the moment you subscribe to it. So that's going to save us from having to do something weird to figure out what the position is supposed to be. So the position will be right now. So let's see how it works. So we drag down and let go, and it animates. This is usually the kind of the fun point for any project, is when you actually get to animate something. I mean, I don't know, how many people here get to work with animations at work? Nobody. Oh, just got a couple people, yeah. It's fun. It's more fun than putting stuff in and out of a database. So, which is like everything else we do, right? So, all right. So we've got that behavior. That's pretty cool, but it doesn't do anything. It's just kind of a toy to play with right now. Let's make it actually refresh the feed when we get far enough. So back to our code. I'm just going to focus again on touch drags again. We don't need to worry about that animation thing at the top. We can see it's still in here in our code, but just focusing on this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use tap again, only this time I'm going to say, okay, if the Y position happens to be greater than half of the height of the window, then I want you to call emit on that refresh event. So that means emit an event from my touch drag to load component. And remember, we wired that up to refresh the news feed. So that's good. But problem with this is now every single time I've dragged lower than that, it's just going to spam that and start requesting a whole bunch of load events, right? So we need to end that somehow. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this take while. So we're saying, on one line, we're saying if we get higher than half the window height, or lower rather than half the window height, then go ahead and trigger this event. And then synchronously, the very next step is going to say, hey, if you happen to be past half the window height, I want you to complete this. So we're only taking values while they're less than or equal to half the window height. So now we have it, so you can see it drag it down once, and it reloads, but it gets stuck. So you don't want it to be stuck. So let's have it animate home after the load is finished. So let's look at all of our code here. This is what we have so far. We got positions here. We've got our touch drags up here at the top. I'm going to focus now on the positions part of this, because what I need to do is I just need to update the positions after that touch drag to load thing is entirely done. And how I'm going to do that is, well, I'm going to add this other property to move home after load, and this is just another animations thing. So, but what I'm doing is now I'm actually using the newsfeed service. Remember, I have load news. Load news is an observable, a shared observable of the actual HTTP request that's going out. So if there's an in-flight HTTP request, this is going to wait for it to be done and give us a value, and then I'm mapping it into our move home animation. So basically, as soon as that HTTP request comes back, it's saying, hey, go ahead and play the animation. And then I'm going to add this other property, position updates, where I'm going to concat our touch drags, that whole thing that takes until you get to the bottom. So the only way it ends is if you've gone past the bottom and it triggered that reload. And when that ends, I'm going to have it play move home after load. So then it's going to sit there and wait for the news feed to be done, and then play the animation to send it back. And then what I need to do is I need to change positions. Instead of being derived from touch drags, have it be derived from position updates. So now we've got it, and it goes back, and it works, but only one time. I drag down again. Uh-oh, what, why? So it's good once, but it's not quite the feature we wanted. We wanted it to work more than once. This is actually a really easy fix, believe it or not. So here's our problem defined. Our problem defined is that we're updating positions based off of position update, and we're playing touch drags until it completes, and then we're playing move home after load until it completes, and then everything's done. Right? That's why it only worked one time. So we need to make this work over and over again. What do we do? That sounds hard. It's actually very easy. In RxJS, we just add a repeat. So we pipe this into a repeat operation, and what that says is, hey, if this completes successfully, subscribe to it again. And it just sets everything up all over again. So now we've got it and it works. But it's a little boring if it doesn't spin, right? Everybody wants their icons to spin. I don't like that random generated stuff is funny to me. Digital protocol parsing panel. All right, so let's make this sucker spin. So we're going to go back and remember our rotation properties that we added. They're currently doing nothing but just saying, here, rotate this 0 degrees. We're going to update this to be something more fun. And what we can do is we can use our same animations tween. So I'm going to say, give me values between 0 and 360, so 360 degrees, over half a second. In this animation tween, it's only going to happen one time, right? It's going to go 0 to 360 degrees in half a second and then be done. So we want that to go over and over again, so guess what we use? Our friend repeat. And now this is an animation that will play and spin over and over and over again. So let's see if that's working. Let's try it out. Ooh, that's exciting. Except it's spinning all the time. That's probably not what we wanted. But it is fun. It's kind of googly, just doing that thing. All right. So, but we want to restrict the spinning to only while the data is loading, instead of just spinning all the time. That would be confusing for our users. So we're back to our code. And what we're going to do here is I'm just going to take this and I'm going to say, hey, whenever someone nexts into refresh, remember our behavior subject, that when someone nexts into it, it emits a value. Whenever someone nexts into refresh, then I want you to start the animation. And we want to take that until the load news returns the result. And one little piece of that is, so if it's taking it until the news comes back, that dot could be pointing like down this way or this way or this way. We'd like it to be back up and centered when it's done. So what I'm doing here, and this is a little trick, is I'm saying concatenate onto the end of it an observable of 0. So this is just like end with 0. Earlier I showed you start with. We're actually going to add an operator because I specifically end up doing this a lot with animations. So it's basically end with 0 is what this is going to do. So let's try it out. Pull down and it reloads. It's got the spin in there and that's it. Our entire feature has been added at this point. Pretty exciting. So after all of that talk and everyone sitting here like, what is Ben talking about? All these crazy words and RxJS stuff. Again, I just want to show you what RxJS is capable of doing. All of that drag behavior was done in roughly 50 lines of code. So if you were to do that all just with imperative code, it would be piles and piles and piles of code that you would have to write, and it would likely be buggier than this, honestly. This has things like deterministic memory management and other interesting features that kind of help you out. The rough side is there's obviously a whole bunch of new phrases. It's kind of a domain-specific language on top of JavaScript. You have to know things like exhaust map and take while and tap. You know, these things are all part of RxJS, and you get those with time. So the summary on this is RxJS is best used for coordinating events. When you're working on these things, you want to work backwards. Start with the simplest thing and kind of build features off of that. And if you need to create an observable dynamically, what you want to do is you want to use wrap it in defer. And that will say, hey, wait until someone subscribes to this, and then create the observable and subscribe to it. There's a take while and repeat pattern that we use in here a couple times where you see like, oh, we compose this really advanced thing, but it ends at this certain point, and it's like, but I want it to last forever. What do I do? Take while or take until, and then you can just repeat right afterwards, and it starts the whole process over again. And then the other thing that I didn't really talk about while I was doing it, but you might have noticed, is I factored out my observables into different properties. So I didn't just, you wouldn't write a function. Observables are basically functions. And you would not write a function that was just one giant monolithic function that did everything, right? That's a bad idea. You want to kind of break those up into individual pieces that make sense. And so with RxJS in Angular, or RxJS in React, or RxJS in Node, or whatever you're doing, I highly recommend breaking the observables down into smaller parts that you can test individually and consume individually. It just makes your code a little bit easier to deal with and refactor. So that's it. If you would like to contribute to RxJS, I'm always looking for great contributors. So you can find us on GitHub at github.com/reactivex/RxJS. You can follow me on Twitter, and then the demo repository for this will be up. Again, I'm going to tweet out the slide deck for this, so you'll have all of these links in the other videos I had linked in here. Thank you very much. So we have time for questions?
Alguém? Alguém quer fazer pergunta? Ninguém?
No questions. It's either I blew everybody's mind so they can't think of a question, or just it was just like, I don't want to. This is not interesting. I don't want to ask questions.
Why did you use React animations instead of CSS animations?
Oh, okay. So the reason I use reactive animations is a lot of this was just building an observable of numbers, right, to figure out where the position of something was. And if I use CSS animations, then it's hard for me to get out of that numeric bit in order to have a single stream of numbers that kind of dictates the position of that icon. I could have used CSS animations and just wrapped it in an observable and had that be like whenever I play move home, just have it wrap that instead, and then waited for that effect to be done before I started emitting more position values. There's nothing really to stop me from doing that, but mostly it was just so everything was kind of the same shape. Everything was an observable of numbers.
Mais alguém?
When you say that we can use it with React, I can use it with Redux and then push events should be reduced after, or it replaces Redux?
So I believe the question was, can you use it with React and with Redux as well? Is that right? Yeah. So absolutely. At Netflix, we used it specifically with React and Redux. I co-authored a library with my friend Jay Phelps called Redux Observable. It's middleware for Redux. And what it does is you can say, you use Redux to kind of manage all of your synchronous state changes. And for the asynchronous part, you use what are called epics in Redux Observable. And what an epic is it's a function that gives you an observable of all the actions that have been played against your reducers. And you're expected to make a new observable of actions that you would like to dispatch. So what you can do is you can say, okay, so if I have an action of this type, then call some Ajax thing or start some WebSocket, and then every time I get an event back, I want to emit a new action of this type, and that will go to your reducer and update state. So you can definitely use those two things. Redux Observable is what I recommend. Look into that.